Well, in 1961, 3 months after the trial of German Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem, a psychologist by the name of Stanley Milgram began an experiment at Yale University to study the psychology of genocide. He was hoping that he could figure out whether or not it was possible that the Nazis were all just accomplices simply following orders. In other words, he was hoping to clear some people of the culpability of what had happened. The Milgram experiment, as it became known, measured the willingness of a diverse group of 40 American men to act against their personal conscience simply because they were told to. Now, participants were told that they were participating in a completely unrelated experiment where they were helping someone else learn faster. And ultimately, they were supposed to administer shocks to the person that was supposed to be the learner in the experiment when they got questions wrong. These electric shocks, they were told, were part of the experiment, but gradually they would get harder and stronger until the shocks would have actually rendered the learner lifeless. Now, prior to the experiment, everyone asked to hypothesize, including Milgram himself, believed that a majority of the participants in the experiment would surely stop administering the shocks at a reasonable place long before they would have been lethal. And yet, everyone who hypothesized that way was wrong. You see, the experiment found unexpectedly that a high proportion of subjects would fully obey the instructions, with every single participant, all 40 men, went up initially to 300 volts, and 65% went all the way up to the full 450 volts, which would have killed the other person that they were in the room with had the shocks been real. Milgram, in an article titled The Perils of Obedience, explained his findings this way. He said, ordinary people simply doing their jobs and without any particular hostility on their part can become agents in a terrible, destructive process. Moreover, even when the destructive effects of their work become patently clear and they are asked to carry out actions incompatible with fundamental standards of morality, relatively few people have the resources needed to resist authority. Welcome to church, everyone. How's that for a takeaway? While the Western world, America, prides itself on free, independent thinking and radical individualism, this experiment, which happened here over 60 years ago, highlights something that we can't change or adapt out of as humans. We are all obedient and live under the authority of something or someone. And if we are malleable to the whims of whatever authority we are living under, our spouses, our boss, our deep-seated ambitions, our culture, the social pressure that comes with it, some political party, whatever authority we submit to, we need to consciously decide because it can absolutely determine the trajectory of our entire lives. Now, in the book of Mark, where we're going to pick up in the passage that I chose today, leading up to this scene, Jesus had been in the middle of the temple courtyards in Jerusalem. He had ultimately been in this verbal contest with the Jewish religious leaders, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, who actually pretty much only agreed about the fact that they didn't like Jesus. Everything else they disagreed about. The religious leaders questioned, by whose authority was Jesus saying all of these outlandish things in their temple? They were the ones who were supposed to have religious authority within the temple walls and over the Jewish people. They tried to trap Jesus so that they could exert their authority over him, pin him with his words, and he sidestepped every single one of these traps with complete ease. And Jesus, in all of these interactions, seems to be making it very clear he was not, in fact, subject to their authority, they were subject to his. And throughout this entire scene at the temple courtyards, it's as if Jesus is laying out a very clear question for the religious leaders who are balking at him, as well as the people who are delighting in his teaching, listening, and also for the disciples sitting at his feet. Whose authority do you really live under? Today, we're going to take a look at the final scene of these temple courtyard interactions. And in this section, we're going to see Jesus give us a riddle, a rebuke, and a remedy. First, a riddle. If you have a Bible, open it with me to Mark chapter 12. We're going to start reading at verse 35. All right, verse 35. While Jesus was teaching in the temple courts, he asked, "Why do the teachers of the law say that the Messiah is the son of David?" David himself, speaking by the Holy Spirit, declared, "The Lord said to my Lord, 'Sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet.'" David himself calls him Lord. How then can he be his son? The large crowd listened to him with delight. So, first, a riddle. Now, after Jesus has his own question, which was set up as a riddle, as you see here, Jesus' question was basically, hey, whose son is the Messiah? Or, in simpler terms, who's this Messiah going to be? Now, the answer would have generally been pretty simple for the Jews who were listening. The crowds that were listening to him would have been like, that's a really simple answer to a really simple question, because everyone knew who this Messiah was supposed to be. It's why earlier in the book of Mark, you see this blind man named Bartimaeus call out, "Son of David, have mercy on me." It's why the crowds, when Jesus entered into Jerusalem, shout triumphantly, "Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David." The people in the courtyard had a long standing assumption based on their scriptures that the Messiah was going to be a direct descendant of the great King David. And Jesus here is pointing them back to scripture, not to correct their understanding, but to fulfill it. Because certainly the Messiah was going to be a descendant of David, but he was also going to be more. He was going to be David's Lord. Jesus quotes Psalm 110, verse 1. And in Psalm 110, the language reads, "The Lord," which in Hebrew is Yahweh, says to my Lord, Adonai, "Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet." Why did David refer to the Messiah as Lord? Now, it's hard to overemphasize how important this riddle actually was, which is why the crowds listening to him, it says that they were filled with delight at his teaching. Jesus actually doesn't answer, or at least Mark doesn't explain or put down his answer to the riddle. He leaves the crowd with what they hear. And in this statement, and quoting Psalm 110, Jesus is actually insinuating a couple things. First, this Messiah was not just a prophet, but he was the true king, which was great news for many of the Jews who were longing for the kingdom of Israel to become what it once was, right? They were living under Roman oppression. They really wanted the kingdom that they had before. But second, in the rest of Psalm 110, it becomes clear this Messiah wasn't just going to be the true king, he was also going to be the high priest. And in the temple, the high priest was the only one directly allowed in what was called the Holy of Holies, which was where the very presence of the Lord dwelled. And in the Old Testament, there's a very, very sharp distinction between kings and priests. Kings rule, priests are the only ones who are allowed to perform sacrifices at the temple for things like atonement. Real quick example of this and the distinction here, or how there was no fuzzying between the distinction. King Uzziah, who was a Judean king, okay? All kings considered pretty good. If you go down the list, a lot of them are just described as evil, 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 evil. King Uzziah was pretty faithful to the Lord. But in his passion and pride, King Uzziah actually entered into the temple to burn incense, which was the job of the priest, and was stricken by leprosy. Okay, two distinct roles. The people thought the Messiah was going to be king, but the Messiah wasn't just going to be king. He was going to be high priest too. Mark, in recording this here, is not so subtly hinting at the fullness of Jesus' identity. And in a sense, he's kind of lifting up the curtain that hides the real secret. This old vision that they had of this coming kingdom wasn't even close to the fullness of what Jesus was actually setting out to do. You see, Jesus didn't come wielding political or military authority, but the authority of the Lord himself. And in his death, he would usher in this new kingdom they were waiting for. This is the closest Jesus has come in the book of Mark up to this point to publicly declaring himself to be not only David's son, but God's. Jesus here in this riddle was hinting at all of the people sitting in the crowds the question that I think he's asking us and has certainly been asking me. Who has ultimate authority? Jesus' answer to this is, I do. Now, immediately after this scene, we're going to see two different postures that were taken in response. The first one actually leads to a rebuke. In verse 38, as Jesus taught, he said, "Watch out for the teachers of the law. They like to walk around in flowing robes and be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and have the most important seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses and for a show make lengthy prayers. These men will be punished most severely." That is definitely a rebuke. Jesus moves swiftly into a rebuke of the ones in the temple who claimed they had authority over it, the religious leaders, or the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Now, he challenges their authority with a bunch of direct accusations. See, the Pharisees really puffed themselves up, and they made sure the people in their community knew they were important. You know how people are like, politicians are like this now, where it's like they come in with all this pomp and circumstance. People know, oh, the VIP is here. This person's really important. They wore clothes that made them look important. They put themselves in positions to sit in important seats, get the right handshakes, kiss the right babies. They preyed on the vulnerable they were entrusted to care for, and instead made their prayer a show. So these religious leaders who were commissioned with a very special role of making much of God instead made much of themselves. And in doing so, they fell into two different traps. And this is where my personal conviction actually started to come in. The two different traps, which I feel like, man, I fall constantly into. The religious leaders, the first one, trap of self obsession. Now, the religious leaders, they thought about themselves all the time. The rebuke was full of situations or circumstances where they were conscious of the way that people were thinking about them. In the marketplace, in the temple, as they walked through throngs of people or sat down at dinner, Jesus is pointing out the fact, hey, these guys thought about themselves all of the time. And when your mind is full of thoughts about you, you know what it can't be full of? Thoughts about God and other people. Jesus had just finished telling people in the temple who were questioning him what the most important commandments actually were. And what were they? They were love God and love people with all you have. The religious leaders had a responsibility to lead people in those two objectives. And Jesus is saying, hey guys, you are failing at these two things. Instead, their self obsession was robbing the people of what authentic love for God looked like because they puffed themselves up and elevated themselves above the people they were meant to serve. Now, it's easy when you read passages like this to say, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, what a bunch of hypocrites. Golly, it's so unattractive, right? Brash egoism like that, how ugly. Why on earth would they let themselves become like this? I think with our kind of Western culture, we can read the Bible and be like, those guys are the bad guys, right? But really, we become like this all the time too. Dale Carnegie, he's this he was like the original self-help guy, right? Like he wrote this book in 1936, which is super famous. It's called How to Win Friends and Influence People. Some of you guys have probably read it. Classic. Think about this. This was 90 years ago, okay? He says in this book, when we are not engaged in thinking about some definite problem, we usually spend about 95% of our time thinking about ourselves. Now, I have no idea how he calculated that 95% of the time, but I thought about it for a little bit and I was like, that probably rings, well, I know it rings true for me. And my guess is with a little bit of self reflection, some of us could probably say, yeah, that doesn't seem too far off, does it? Pretty believable. I mean, we live in a selfie, self absorbed, self actualized, self care culture that creates the same trap that these religious leaders fell in. We love thinking about us. Tim Keller, in his incredible teeny tiny book, which I like, if you could read one book this summer and just get it into you, I would read this one. It's called The Freedom of Self Forgetfulness. Probably will take you an hour. It's like literally teeny tiny book. It's amazing. But in this book, he says, the natural condition of the human ego is that it is empty, painful, busy, and fragile. Our pride is not rooted out by lowering our self-esteem or by raising our self-esteem. The solution is not thinking higher of yourself or lower of yourself, but thinking about yourself less. Humility is thinking about yourself less. And Jesus was rebuking the Pharisees quite simply for thinking about themselves too much. The real warning here for the people listening wasn't just, hey, don't become like those guys over there. It was also something else, which I think we also need to pay attention to. It's be careful who you follow because their authority influences your life, whether you like it or not. Just like the people in the crowd were susceptible to leaders who could point them away from the heart of God, we absolutely are too. In fact, if you have been around anywhere on the globe the past few years, we've seen so many leaders lose their position because of bad choices and of faulty authority that they've wielded over people. Who we follow matters. We need to be careful that who we follow, the people that we're following, actually are exhibiting what the Bible calls spiritual fruit: kindness, peace, patience, joy, faithfulness, self control, humility, things like that. And let me tell you, my guess is that means that the people that influence you the most should be the ones that are the closest to you. Don't let people who are far off and distant, who you don't have a personal relationship, be your primary influencers, because ultimately, you can't see the spiritual fruit that they're bearing and you can't see their flaws. It's much easier to follow people who make Jesus seem the way that you wish he was. But here's the thing: God always challenges us to grow. We are always in growth with him, which is why I love that you guys call them growth groups. That's so cool. Our whole lives, somebody once told me, if you're not dead, you're not done. And I feel like that should just be a mantra. It's just like, you're not dead, you're not done, right? Like, we're just constantly in a state of growth in our relationship with Jesus. But if our vision of Jesus doesn't challenge us anymore, it's because most of the time, our vision of Jesus actually becomes a reflection of us. And at that point, we're not living under his authority anymore. We're living under our own. I'm going to repeat that again. If your vision of Jesus is not big enough to challenge you, your vision of Jesus is actually a reflection of yourself. And if that's the case, then you may be in the trap of self-obsession, which leads us to our second trap: the trap of exploitation. I can talk. Now, this seems like a big leap, but it's not, because the second part of this rebuke, Jesus rebuked the religious leaders for making themselves look good in front of others, and then he drops in this little phrase. He says, they devour widows' houses. Now, in the Old Testament, widows and orphans were absolutely the most vulnerable people group because they had no societal protection based in a patriarchal culture that ran on family. In Scripture, over and over and over again, God mandates care for widows and orphans, care for widows and orphans, care for widows and orphans. And over again, he actually rebukes his people. And the basis for the rebuke is, hey, are you guys caring for widows and orphans? Are you caring for the marginalized, the vulnerable people? Because if you're not, I'm not so happy about it. He mandates it over and over. God always cares about the most vulnerable. And by declaring that the religious leaders devour widows' houses, Jesus is saying that these religious leaders have switched from protecting and caring for the most vulnerable to preying on them, all while being super spiritual in their super long prayers that are impressing everyone. They exploited the weakness of others and covered it up with their religion. The truth is, the more self-obsessed we are, the easier it is to deny the image of God in another person, or the imago Dei. Pride puffs us up, and it gives us this sense of entitlement over other people's things, their rights, their privileges, their care. It makes us feel like we deserve more than other people do. C.S. Lewis said, pride gets no pleasure out of having something, only out of having more of it than the next man. It's the comparison that makes you proud, the pleasure of being above the rest. Once the element of competition is gone, pride is gone with it. Pride is the reason humans are capable of exploitation. Now, exploitation is a really big word, and I know you guys are really passionate about justice at Canvas, which is incredible. Oftentimes when we think of exploitation, we think of things like human trafficking or slavery or unfair trade. But the only reason that those big giant exploitations that seem obvious to the world can exist is because the little versions of them are allowed to exist first. And in our context, in San Francisco here, those little exploitations that we actually have the capacity to participate in every day might look something like this. Only spending time with the people who you feel benefit you when they benefit you. Knowing people's weaknesses or sins and using them against them. Refusing to affirm someone because it makes you feel worse about yourself. Pornography. Ignoring whether your money goes to places and businesses that harm people to make products. Not caring about or scoffing at marginalized people because you disagree with them or their choices. Believe it or not, according to the way of Jesus, disagreeing with someone, even wholeheartedly, is not actually an excuse not to love them. I mean, here in San Francisco, there are all kinds of people groups who fit into all kinds of categories and boxes, and it's really easy to write people off based on those boxes. Pigeonholing people is easy. Loving people is hard. And loving people is what we're called to do, especially if we're fighting against the exploitation and the pride that exists in our own selves. Jesus rebuked the Pharisees for the posture of their hearts, which allowed them to exploit other people and remove the imago Dei in the way that they viewed people. Now, told you, I was convicted by all this stuff, okay? So how can we see and how can we tell if we've fallen into these traps? Well, here are some questions that I think we can answer for ourselves. And if you're brave, you can answer for yourself, or you can ask your spouse or your best friend or your parent these questions. That's if you're super brave. I haven't asked my husband these questions yet, so maybe I will, and maybe I'll wait. We'll see. Okay, 1, do other people's accomplishments feel like a threat to you? 2, when you walk into a room, do you wonder first about how people will receive you or how you will receive them? 3, do you feel like what is on the outside of your life accurately reflects what's on the inside? Or 4, do you have places or behaviors in your life you justify by telling yourself you deserve it or that the other person doesn't? Yeah, hard questions, good questions, questions that take stuff out of us and root out the stuff that's like, man, this has no place in me because I'm a follower of Jesus. Your answers may tell you where in your life you've fallen into those traps and show you where you're living under authority that's actually not the authority of Jesus. You see, there was a sharp contrast here between the authority of the Messiah and the authority of the religious leaders. The rule of the Messiah was one which was ultimately cloaked in humility. And the rule of the religious leaders was just puffed up egoism that was cloaked in religious ritual. Whose authority we live under determines the trajectory of our lives. Your pride can't exist under the authority of Jesus. So whose authority do you really live under? Mark, in his record, though, doesn't just end the temple teachings with this rebuke. Quite thankful for that, actually. Instead, he wraps up this whole thing with this really curious scene that serves as a remedy. I'm going to pick up at verse 41. Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put and watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. Many rich people threw in large amounts, but a poor widow came and put in 2 very small copper coins worth only a few cents. Calling his disciples to him, Jesus said, "Truly, I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. They all gave out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything, all she had to live on." The remedy. Jesus watches from a distance the behavior of those giving at the temple. He situates himself over off to the side. He's got his disciples with him. And the treasuries were these like trumpet-shaped boxes that collected people's offering. And he watches a bunch of people put their coins in. Now, they were metal, which meant that when you put a bunch of coins in, it made a really large sound. Okay, so essentially, if people put in lots of coins and lots of money, it was a show, right? It was like, oh my gosh, look how much money that person made, would put in. And then this widow, perhaps one of the women the religious leaders were exploiting, who knows? I think there's no like this. It's not a coincidence that Jesus had just rebuked them for the way they treated widows, and then this widow appears right afterward. This widow walks up and puts in 2 small coins. They were called quadrants at the time. They were the smallest in Roman circulation. Okay, so essentially think pennies. Okay, little tiny things. This was a very small amount. No trumpets would have blown for this gift. No special attention would have happened because of the clinking as it fell into the coffer. Okay, and despite the smallness of this amount, which would have gone completely unnoticed by everyone else, Jesus commends her over all the rich people who had come before her. He praises her for giving all she had to live on. But I think the key word in this passage is surprising. It's not all, it's not any of those words. It's actually poverty. The rich gave out of their wealth, the widow gave out of her poverty. This passage isn't simply talking about money and giving. In fact, most sermons that you'll hear on this passage is actually about money. Here, though, it's kind of the same way as Jesus wasn't simply the son of David. This isn't simply about financial poverty, but about poverty of heart. The emptying of what you cling to most so that your whole dependence is actually on the Lord. This is the kind of poverty that Henry Nouwen, who's just one of my favorites, he describes as the spiritual poverty that frees us to love God and love people. It's a heart posture that allows you to love people well. Henry Nouwen puts it this way: poverty is the inner disposition that allows us to take away our defenses and turn our enemies into friends. We can only perceive the stranger as an enemy as long as we have something to defend. But when we say, "Please enter, my house is your house, my joy is your joy, my sadness is your sadness, and my life is your life," we have nothing to defend, since we have nothing to lose, but all to give. This woman, in her poverty, gave all that she had to live on to honor the Lord, knowing that all of it belonged to him anyway. Now, most of us have places in our lives where we live on things that we don't want to surrender to God. We don't want to host the Lord in places in our lives because, quite frankly, we don't want him to come in. And it's not that we're not followers of Jesus. It's not that we're not active disciples. It's that for all of us, there are places and things that give us, temporal comfort, or things that make us feel like we're in control, that are particularly difficult to release to him. We fear losing control or our sense of self, or honestly, because of experiences we've had, most of us fear that he's going to take something we're not ready to give, or we'll have to sacrifice some of that pride that props up our self-worth. We live on things like our family needing us, or our titles making us feel important, or our efficiency or our ambitions moving us forward, or even those like little tiny harmless habits that we nurse under the guise of self-care or empowerment. Now, I'm not saying that self-care is not a good thing, okay? I do think we definitely need to care for ourselves. In fact, in the commandment, Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself, right? So it does mean we need to care for ourselves. However, a lot of times we can use self-care as a crutch in order for us to keep from depending on God. Now, the irony is that it's only as we empty ourselves before God, that's when we, in our poverty, become free to depend on him, the only one who can actually sustain and carry us. This poor widow she was actually the one, of all the people that were in the temple, she was the one who was free. She didn't give because she was going to be noticed. No one besides Jesus noticed her. She didn't give because she was guilted into it or because she wanted to impress, because there was nothing impressive about her or her offering. She gave because she knew whose authority she was entrusting her life with. And that is the call for those of us who want to live under the authority of Jesus. To live under the authority of Jesus, we need to become poor. That's the remedy to pride and the key to self-forgetfulness: poverty. Now, let me tell you, this is where my conviction got really intense. I've been convicted over and over and over again of my own pride in this passage, and that's why I chose it. Because my pride is real sneaky. I'm a pastor, okay? And I love helping people. But when my pride starts to usurp the authority of Jesus, my helping actually has a really sinister motivation. I start to want to be recognized for it, and I get really resentful when I'm not. Last weekend, for example, I hosted a shower for a very dear friend, and the co-host showed up before to help set up. It was the first time I'd met her, And our interactions were ill-fated from the very beginning. You know those things where it just starts and you're like, oh gosh, this is going downhill very quickly. Okay. We had a weird first interaction, and normally I'm pretty good at getting over stuff like this. I'm a pastor, I talk to lots of different people, but last Saturday was different. My feathers got ruffled, and I could not get over it all day long. And then when everyone started thanking my co-host for being the host of the shower, whoa, internal rage machine turned on. Now, egos have a way of propping you up all the while eating you whole from the inside, okay? I wanted to be recognized. I wanted to be in charge. I wanted someone to see all the work that I had actually put into this shower. Do you ever have moments or experiences like that? Maybe not. Maybe it's just me, but there were deeper things going on inside of me than just being angry about that initial reaction. And God, in his mercy, last weekend, yet again reminded me what spiritual poverty means. This is a silly example, but it pointed to other stuff going on inside of me. I needed to remember resentment and dependence on God are completely incompatible. You cannot hold on to resentment and depend on God at the same time. It is impossible. Spiritual poverty this past week looked like me asking God to actively come into my consciousness and sweep away the thoughts that had landed me in the trap of self obsession. It felt, and it has felt over and over again, like I have to physically release that to Him in prayer, trusting that He's better at holding situations than I am, the situations that make me angry or afraid or bitter. He's got them. I don't have to hold them. And it's only after I surrender them to Him that I feel internally free and able to love people around me with any kind of grace or truth. It's not for it's and it's not really for their sake, it's also for my sake as well. Spiritual poverty requires an emptying of yourself before God. Now, that might mean emptying yourself of physical things that hold you hostage. Maybe it's money. Actually, it's probably money for most of us. But also maybe other things you spend that 95% of the time dwelling on, right? Maybe it might mean emptying yourself of anger. Perhaps there's something that's happened in the past couple months or maybe in the past few years that you can't get over, and your anger just feels like it's just waiting below the surface of your life and it can pop out at any time. Perhaps that's what you need to get over or surrender to Him, I should say. Perhaps it's unforgiveness or control over your relationships or your image or your career. You see, living under the authority of Jesus is not movement from weakness to power, but the movement where in becoming poor, we actually become less defensive, less fearful, and more open to other people, even when it leads to suffering. The remedy Jesus is proposing here is poverty. To live under the authority of Jesus, we need to become poor. Now, the Milgram experiment, that really uplifting way that I started this inspiring message in the beginning of the talk, exposed that everyone lives obedient to something or someone, and what we submit to determines the course of our lives. And while the Milgram experiment could point to bad news and human frailty and evil, I think it points to really good news for the follower of Jesus. Because Jesus, in coming and living among us, actually exposed exactly the kind of authority he offers us to come under. Though he has ultimate authority over all things, Paul tells us in Philippians that he made himself a servant of all and submitted himself to death, even death on a cross. You see, the beauty of submitting to Jesus' authority is that we can trust the direction of our lives because of his character and his intentions for us. He went first in all things, and he submitted himself to the death that we deserve so that we could know him and come under his lordship and authority. True life lives under the authority of Jesus. That's true life. So, is your life submit to him, or is it submit to something else? Now, again, I know I gave you guys a whole bunch of really crazy questions earlier, but I'm going to leave you with just three questions to think about. And maybe you can, even as we go back into worship, be thinking through. Is your generosity of your time, talents, money, is it ostentatious or is it quiet? Does your life make much of your importance, or Jesus' importance? Do you trust God enough to become poor? Those are the three questions. True life exists under the authority of Jesus. And I have had to learn this both painfully and again and over and over again this summer. And I am learning yet again and again and again what it looks like to submit to the lordship and authority of Jesus. So as we enter back into worship, I'd love you to think about whose authority you're submitting yourself to. Perhaps you're in here and you're like, it's wonderful. I feel like for the first time, or maybe a first time in a long time, I actually am living under his authority as a follower of Jesus. Perhaps you're in a place where you can see how submitting to his authority has completely changed you. You can see fruit in your own life. You feel more free and more confident. Let me tell you, feeling that way is not prideful. It's beautiful, and it can be absolutely honest, and you can rejoice in that. You can rejoice in the way that you feel that. But perhaps you're a follower of Jesus, and you know there are places in your life you're holding back. Maybe there's places in your life, man, I don't know if I'm ready to become poor in this. I don't know if I'm ready to surrender this. Perhaps you're struggling to trust the Lord in general. Bring that to him. God doesn't want us to bring who we aren't to him. He wants us to bring who we are. Perhaps your prayer today is just, Lord, change me so I want to submit to your authority, right? Lord, I want to want you, but I don't know if I want you yet. And maybe you're in here and you're like, I don't know. And there's a lot going on in me and I need prayer. I would encourage you, don't leave here without asking for prayer from someone, because I know there are people in here who would be more than happy to pray with you and for you and to ask God to come intercede. Perhaps in here you're like, I just came here. I don't know what I'm doing here. I'm not a follower of Jesus. Maybe you don't know why someone would submit to him at all. But let me tell you, his authority is not heavy-handed or demanding. His authority is not manipulative or self-indulgent. His authority is selfless. It's perfectly loving. His authority casts out fear, and though it is powerful enough to make the demons flee, and by his name darkness gets pushed back, it is gentle enough to invite us in and asks us not to perform for acceptance, but instead he gives us the verdict of clean, and then compels us to surrender the things that demand our affection, so instead we can both love and be loved. That is the goodness and authority that we get to submit to. So let's pray. Heavenly Father, what good